my left to the right. So if you're there, is that what you want to do?
Yeah.
Okay, then you should go a little clear.
Okay, did we talk about this? This is how we think about it, but I'll present it like this, but it's really going to be more like this. Okay, we're more like this. Did we?
Yeah.
We do these? Okay. So we talked about how we have to decide which agent, that there's way too many RFPs out there. Now, when I say there's way too many RFPs, let's talk about how the money part of it happens. So when, let's say for example, you're going to bid an engineer on a contract. So let's say you paid the engineer, their actual salary is $75. You pay them $75 an hour. Is that the price you're going to charge the government?
No,
What are you going to add to that?
several things. Overhead, G&A.
Right, so you're going to add some amount of overhead. You're going to add some amount of G&A, overhead, and then general administrative. There's something called FECOM, and then there's profit. I'm just going to say $4 so we end up with $100. Okay, so this is the price you're going to give to the government, and these are the individual cost elements. So one of the things the government cares about is how did you come up with $10 for G&A and $10 for overhead? So what were the three factors we talked about last time as to whether or not they're looking, when they look at what goes into building these up, what are the three things that we said had to happen, that your costs had to comply with?
That it's realistic.
Reasonableness.
Yep, reasonable, good.
Allocability.
I'm sorry?
Allocability.
Allocability.
Allowability.
Look at you. So proud of you guys.
Go, go, go.
That means you'll type up our next proposal for helping you out with that.
And the prize is, type the proposal for Mary Ann. Congratulations.
Yeah, so when we talked about the Mont Blanc pen, right, it wouldn't be considered a reasonable cost to a prudent business person. We talked about allocability. Half of us are doing government work in here, half of us are doing commercial work. If it's 50-50, you would expect the price of the lights that everyone's using to be allocated 50-50. And then finally, is it allowable? We said the FAR states certain things flat out aren't allowable. What's an example of flat out not allowable?
Alcohol.
Alcohol. But things like bid and proposal cost could be considered allocable, could not be considered allowable. So we talked about all that. Now, so the government's going to look at, when they do an indirect rate audit of you, they're going to look at these two in particular. And they're going to, overhead and G&A, and they're going to look at each of the costs that you have in there. So, for example, the cost of your lights, the cost of your executive team, the cost of your legal resources, the cost of sales and marketing. All of these different types, the heat, the actual lease that you pay on your building. All those elements are going to fall somewhere in here between overhead and G&A. And what was the one thing, does the government care whether they fall into overhead or G&A?
No.
No, but
Once
what
you
do they
assign
get?
to that category, it's where it has to stay.
You know,
She just had one of her moments.
Oh.
what, I'm sorry, what?
She just had one of her moments.
I know, I love it when people like,
Participate, yeah.
yeah, a lot of times I'll teach like undergraduates and you ask them a question and they're just like, you get no response. You're just like, seriously, I was up here for 3 hours. Like none of it resonated, like not even a little bit. Okay, thank you, I needed that. So your overhead G&A, they don't care where you're putting the cost as long as you're putting it in one of them, and once you put it there, you keep it there so that they can monitor your rates if they change over time. What might be something that changes your rates?
Inflation and material costs.
Yeah, material costs. Well, material costs would be a direct cost if they were being used to manufacture your product. So that would be a direct charge. But things like your inflation could change it. Like if you had a sudden surge, like when it's really cold up in Minnesota, I'm sure they're paying more for heat. They're causing that to escalate because there's such a surge on the system. So things like that. They expect fluctuations when it comes to things like that. So what the government wants to do is when they look at, one of the things that you can put into these rates is you can put a certain amount, certain percentage of your bid and proposal costs into these rates. So the government, your auditor would say to you, you can put up to, if you have $10,000 in government contracts, you might be able to put 5% of your, you can put in 5% of your bid and proposal costs, of your total contract values. So if you have 10,000, you could take 5% of that, and that can be your B&P pool, your bid and proposal pool. And what that means is that you can put that into one of these categories, and it would be considered an allowable expense. So that 5% you would be able to recoup through your labor rates, through your indirect rates. If you spend more than 5%, what happens?
It's on you.
Right, so it comes out of your profit. So now let's say you've won the contract, and now your engineer starts working, and they're on week 1, and they work, and then they work for 4 weeks, and then you get an acceptance document, the government accepts their work, and then you invoice them. And then the government has 30 days to pay. When this whole process happens, you get $100 for every hour that this person worked from weeks 1 to 4. So if you assume 40 hours a week, you get 160 hours that they've worked. You multiply 160 times this number, and that's what you can expect to get paid by the government. This doesn't physically happen, but you need to think about it like this. When this money comes in, what happens to it?
What comes from the government to me?
Yeah.
We deposit it to the checking account, honestly.
We deposit it into a checking account, and then what?
It's allocated across your different,
Right, so this person has to eat, so you have to make sure you pay them $75 times 40, times 160, right? Because that's what they've worked. Now probably you're paying, you haven't stopped paying them over the time. So, but just think about it. The 75 times 160 has to go back to the engineer. The 160 times 10 goes back to overhead, to pay all your overhead expenses. 160 times 10 goes to pay all your G&A expenses. A certain amount goes, 160 times 1 goes to your FECOM, and FECOM is facilities capital cost of money. So is a dollar worth more today or in 3 years? Right, so the fact that it's worth more today is what this FECOM calculation is. And then 160 times 4 goes to your profit pool. So you multiply, it goes back to your profit pool. So now this is the profit that you're operating under. How many people use an Outlook? I'm not talking about the product Outlook, but an Outlook system where you say to your leaders, tell me your annual budget, and then Outlook it every month for me, so that I know how much revenue is coming in, how much expenses are going out. How many people do that Outlook process? What do the rest of you do? Is it a surprise every month?
Just rolling with it.
At least it's honest.
It's a variation on that, but it's just,
We know what we had to do every week to be able to get by, so we plan for that. I mean, it fluctuates so much.
Yeah, so what an Outlook process does is it says, okay, we're in February, and I would be outlooking March. So I would have already given them my annual budget through December, and I would have already taken either made educated assumptions about what my numbers are going to be, or I've made swags. What's the swag?
Severely wild, that scares.
Right. So either scenario plays out, right, where I think about what I'm going to be spending over the year, and then each month I have to predict the next 3 months how much money's coming in. Now, difference is small business versus large business. EDS reported up, we were on, Wall Street paid attention to us. So we had to be very clear about what our profitability was. We had to be honest to our shareholders, and all that comes with a lot of SEC filings and all this other kind of stuff, which is why you can do what you do and what we had to do what we did. But when we would report that, we would have to say, okay, here's what we think we're going to do for March, April, and May. And we told you before that we were going to be at a 10% profit, but we're only going to be at a 9% profit. And when I reported that, I had to explain why there was a 1% difference in my profit. And I had to explain that because my 1% change, and you're in another part of EDS, your 1% change and your 1% change, all of a sudden could make this EDS profit number go down quite a bit, right? If we're all not making our numbers. And that could cause a problem for Wall Street, right? Because then our earnings aren't as high as they're expected to be. We just saw what happened with Apple, right? They thought their earnings were going to be here, but they're going to be down here, and they're blaming China, and all kinds of things are going on. So companies outlook so that they can explain any kind of changes that are going to occur. In the government space, when you have a fixed price contract, is it easy to do this? This outlooking process? Yeah, why is it easy?
This will be the same thing too.
I know how much it's going to be. I know how much I'm going to get done. I know. If it's a cost reimbursable contract or indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity, where the government doesn't know what their requirements are, how easy is it for me to do this process?
Not at all, no.
Not, right? But yet, the companies still require you to do this. And quite honestly, in my case, we were in Herndon, we were like right outside of Washington, D.C., and our corporate headquarters were down in Plano, Texas. And I am convinced Plano, Texas never understood government business because it was so different than commercial business. So they didn't understand why we had such fluctuations. So my point in telling you all this is that when you're thinking about indirect rates, you use them to build up what your price is to the government, and then every hour you work, that person works, a little bit goes back to each of these pools. So just be thinking about that. And so if you overspend your bid and proposal budget, then that comes right out of your profit. Everybody with me? Okay. So because you have to be very careful about that bid and proposal budget, you have to really carefully decide which RFPs you're going to pursue, because like I said, there's lots of candy out there, and you have to decide what's going to make the most sense. We'll talk about how you do that.
Mary, you mentioned, though, to make sure you put anything on your proposal exactly what you mean, because they could at any point say, okay, deal, and like a digital handshake's done. But then you also said that if they detect like something was incorrect with your bid or that you misunderstood, like where is that fine line to where they're like, oh my God, we could get this guy to do the same work for literally a third of the cost just because he made a mistake versus we're going to notify them.
Thank you,
when
good
they
question.
change it.
So invitation for bids is where they can, if they identify a mistake,
Okay.
then that's...
If it's an actual RFP.
If it's an actual RFP, you have up until the time they make an award to send in a corrected bid, to say the old one, and they can decide whether or not they're going to allow you to do that. So you can send, so when you and we'll talk about this later, but when you send in your proposal, you send in a transmittal letter with it that says, thank you for the opportunity to bid on this NIHDL solicitation number, uppity squat. Enclosed, please find our proposal. We are taking no exception to any of the government terms and conditions, or we are taking exception to the following terms and conditions. If you take exception, you've now become a harder contractor to evaluate, and the government could just say, forget about it. I'm going to kick you out of the competitive range. And the last piece of information you give them is this proposal is good for 60 days, and you give them a date by which it's good. Because if the government delays, like to 90 days, and all of a sudden, the price of heat skyrockets, you don't want to be held to the prices you came up with because you didn't know about that, and they delayed. So you always give them a time frame. But up until the time they make a contract award, you can decide to withdraw your bid. And if you withdraw it because you realize you've made a mistake that's going to take you under, that's in your best interest to do. You won't be considered for award. Sometimes if you tell them it's a mistake, the government has to have at least 3 competitive bids. If they only have 2 competitive bids and you're one of them and you made a mistake, they're going to do everything they can to keep you in, which means they may say, here's an amendment, and open it up again so that the 2 of you have an equal footing. But if they have 30 bids in, they're just going to say, forget about it. So they're going to do what's in their best interest when it comes to something like that. All right, we talked about all these people. We're going to talk about more specifically what they do later on today. Okay. When we talk about the solution, keep this in mind for yourselves. It's the technical solution, whatever it is that you are bidding, whatever it is your product or service. If they ask you for a management solution, you need to present it to them. But if they don't ask for a management solution, you still need to figure one out internally. A good exercise is if the government awarded you the contract tomorrow, what would you do? What kinds of things do you have to do if you're going to be awarded a contract tomorrow?
Get the whole team together and make sure they understand all terms of the proposal, or not of the proposal, but of the contract that is being worked on.
Mm-hmm. So their RFP coupled with your proposal is everything you have to commit to. So you would want to educate your team members on what those things were. What else would you want to do? And when you say team, who's your team?
Anyone and everyone that's going to be involved in any part of the manufacturing process.
Right, which means it could be your internal people, it's your salespeople, it's your external subcontractors, it's your actual core team. It can be anybody that's associated with it. You want to make sure they all understand. What else would you have to do? So I send you I'm the government, I send you a delivery order for 100 widgets that you have to manufacture.
You've got to get your raw materials in place or buy the 100 widgets or whatever you got to do.
Exactly. So there needs to be those relationships established with all those subcontractor organizations to be able to say, so the first thing that has to happen is you have to review the task order or the delivery order. We talk about task order when it's services, labor type stuff that they're buying. We use the term delivery order when it's product. Either one, the first thing you have to do is verify that everything the government ordered is what?
To specification.
This is just their ordering form. What do we have to make sure is happening there?
That it is exactly what's in the contract you're supposed to be doing.
Exactly. So when the government comes out with their RFP and we come back with a proposal and they accept it as is, right? They don't even have a conversation with us. They accept it, which is what your question was. Or if we go through negotiations and then they sign on the dotted line and we sign on the dotted line, we now have a contract baseline. And it has every single product and every single service with a price for each, a description of each, for each year of the contract. So if it's a 5-year contract, you have to give them prices for this year and 5 years out, or 4 years out. And the government operates on government fiscal year, which is probably different.